Welcome back to Celluloid Dreams, the psychology of film, and this time we're engaging in comedy subgenres, which is an extension of our last episode where we started talking about the elements of comedy and tropes and so forth. This time we're going to finish up on that subject and spend the whole episode discussing the subgenres. And the first one that we're going to start with is slapstick. So slapstick is a type of comedy which is physical in nature. The humor is visual in approach, oftentimes caused by the character reacting to a situation involving some degree of danger, but usually doesn't cause any great harm to the character. But it's humorous in that the character is clumsy or gets out of the situation by way of having an extraordinary amount of luck. Slapstick humor has been around since the beginning of film, and our first examples are going to be a few silent films of note. One of the most famous images in classic comedy is from Safety Last from 1923, in which Harold Lloyd scales a skyscraper. You might have seen the shot where a man is hanging from a clock above a street and looks like he could fall to his death at any point, but don't worry. This was not filmed without any safety measures beneath the actor, but the clever way that it was shot did look like there was actual danger involved. Another actor who was famous for seemingly dangerous setups was Buster Keaton. A good example of a film in which his character escapes all kinds of danger is Sherlock Jr. from 1924. There's a famous scene where he gets on the front of a motorcycle driven by a policeman sitting on the handlebars, and at some point, fairly early in the process, he loses the driver and he continues riding through all kinds of intersections and traffic with all kinds of near misses and somehow escapes suffering any harm. So continuing on the subject of classics, let me introduce my co-host Matt, who's going to dive right in with his example.
Welcome back, everyone. Mike just mentioned Sherlock Jr. with Buster Keaton. Well, in 1926, Buster Keaton was the star and co-director of The General, and he plays a railroad engineer who has his favorite locomotive known as the General stolen. So he pursues the Union spies who stole his favorite locomotive. And there's one particularly amazing sequence that involves what they commonly call the railroad tie stunt. And what he does is he climbs out on a moving locomotive from the control compartment onto the very front of the locomotive. He hops off of the locomotive, which is moving rather slowly, but still quickly enough. And he runs ahead on the train tracks and picks up a railroad tie, one of these big, heavy pieces of lumber that's literally used to support a railroad track. And he gets back on the front of the locomotive with this large piece of railroad tie, and he uses it to push another piece of railroad tie out of the way and continuing his locomotive down the tracks in a safe manner. Well, a variety of things could have gone wrong with this stunt. He could have tripped and gotten run over by the locomotive, which would have taken hundreds of feet probably to slow down and stop. Or he could have missed getting that piece of lumber off the tracks, which could have potentially disrailed the railroad car. So it was a pretty amazing stunt by standards of the time and even by today's standards. There's another pretty amazing sequence in The General that involves the burning bridge. And by all accounts, it was the most expensive stunt or gag that was performed in the silent era. I believe at the time it cost $42,000. And what it involved was a burning bridge over a river and a train going over that bridge. The bridge has succumbed to weakness from the fire, and the train falls into the river. And it's an amazing sequence, even by today's standards. You look at this and go, yeah, this is all pre-CG. There's no miniatures here. It's real train on a real bridge that they set afire and collapsed, and that train and that bridge are in that river. And it's a pretty amazing stunt.
So you can't talk about slapstick without talking about Charlie Chaplin. And in 1931, one of his most beloved films, City Lights, was released. Right at the start, the physical humor begins where there's an unveiling of a statue, which reveals that the little tramp is asleep on the statue that's being presented to the town. Everyone, of course, is shocked, and he is as well, as he's awakening to see all these people staring at him. As he climbs down, there's a sword on the statue that gets stuck in the rear of his pants, so he can't really get off of the statue as he's trying to do. So he has to then resituate himself to get his pants unhooked. And as he's climbing down, he sits on the face of part of the statue, much to the dismay of the onlookers. There's also a famous boxing match in the film in which the little tramp is clearly outmatched by his competitor. So he runs around frantically trying to avoid the strikes that are coming his way, using the referee as a human shield. So even at this point where talkies were starting to come into play, Charlie Chaplin still had plenty of inspiration left to keep amusing the audience using the same type of visual humor he'd been using for years.
In 1933, the Marx Brothers delivered Duck Soup, a political satire that also contains slapstickish physical gags. And in this particular film, there's a scene known as the mirror scene. And Harpo Marx portrays a character known as Pinky in the film, while Groucho Marx portrays Rufus T. Firefly. And in the film, a mirror breaks and Pinky is dressed up just like Rufus, and they square off against each other, one in front of where the mirror would have been, and the other on the other side of where the mirror would have been. And they essentially mirror each other's movements. And it's a real clever scene that goes on for several minutes. They move from one direction to the other, and it must have taken a lot of rehearsal time to actually pin this down. And at the end of the sequence, they actually physically interact where Rufus's hat falls off and Pinky picks it up and gives it to him. And then they both walk out of frame together. But if you haven't seen that film or that sequence, it's really worth watching. It's a really great example of a 1930s slapstick sequence. So slapstick continued through the history of cinema. In 1974, Mel Brooks brought us Blazing Saddles, which he co-wrote and directed. There's a really entertaining piece of slapstick in the film where a character by the name of Mongo, who incidentally is played by the late Alex Karras. And Alex Karras, interestingly enough, was a all-pro defensive tackle in the NFL. And not long actually after he did his work in Blazing Saddles, he ended up going to work on a TV sitcom known as Webster. And I think most people know him with a mustache from that show. But in Blazing Saddles, his character of Mongo didn't have a mustache. He was tanned up and big and a bruiser and a drunk and a real bully. So in this particular sequence, he rides into town on a bull, full-on bull with horns and everything, gets off the bull, ties it up, and one of the townspeople's on his horse. He says, "Hey, you can't park that bull there." And so Mongo walks over to the horse, pow, and just decks the horse. And it's one of those very popular little bit from the film that's shown quite often. There's also another really great slapstick moment that can be described as the candygram for Mongo. So we're in a saloon and Sheriff Bart comes in dressed in a kind of a mailing-gram uniform. And he says, "Candygram for Mongo, candygram for Mongo." And he comes in and gives Mongo this box. And Mongo's not so smart, but Mongo says, "Mongo like candy." So Mongo opens the box and kaboom, it had a bomb in it. So Mongo got blown up. And of course, Sheriff Bart got out of there and he didn't get harmed. But it's a real funny scene.
Yeah, and it's kind of a cartoonish scene in a sense because it's almost like something you would see in a Looney Tunes thing. So they kind of play into it a bit where Sheriff Bart, as he's leaving, giving the candygram to Mongo and using his wit, in a sense, to figure out a way to beat this behemoth guy that he certainly can't beat in a fight. So he's hightailing it out of there and he's putting his fingers in his ears before the explosion comes. It's almost like you're watching a cartoon character getting out of there and escaping. The exaggerated nature of the scene, they lean right into it up to the point where the explosion goes off.
We can't discuss slapstick and physical gags without mentioning Airplane from 1980, co-directed by the Zucker brothers and Jim Abrams. And a couple of bits from that film we'll discuss. We have Captain Rex Kramer, played by Robert Stack, who's going through the airport terminal, and he's in pilot uniform. And he's approached by all these charitable collectors. We've got religious folks. I think there's one guy that mentions he's with Scientology. We've got, a variety of different people trying to collect. And he's not in any mood for this. So he is initially shoving them away, and then he starts punching them, and then he becomes kind of a pseudo kung fu expert and starts kicking them and throwing them around. Once he gets through them, he continues on his path through the terminal. But it's a really clever scene. It looked to me like Robert Stack did it all himself. It was a one-take Willie as the camera was dollying through the airport following him. So it's really clever, really well done. Then there's a sequence in the film that deals with a woman who is hysterical on the flight, and she's worried she's going to die. And so we've got the flight attendant that comes up and shakes her and smacks her. And then we've got others that come up and shake her. And then camera pans back and we see a whole line of people waiting to have their crack at her. And then at one point we see in the line, there's a woman with a gun, and the scene cuts before we end up seeing what she does. But needless to say, it's some great slapstick and a really cool physical gag. The Naked Gun from the Files of Police Squad in 1988 starred the late, great Leslie Nielsen. And there's a couple of really hysterical sequences in this particular film. One scene involves a baseball game where there's a fictitious opera singer known as Enrico Palazzo. And Leslie Nielsen's character of Frank Drebin ends up impersonating Enrico Palazzo. The sequence where he sings the national anthem is absolutely hilarious, and he completely makes an ass out of himself and botches it. It's kind of reminiscent of, well, I think Frank Drebin probably did a better job than Roseanne Barr, but maybe not by much. As Frank Drebin is doing this horrible rendition of the national anthem, it cuts to the real Palazzo, who's tied up and watching a television that's showing the game and showing Drebin's performance. And it's obviously horrible. And Palazzo's freaking out and wanting to get free and try to protect his reputation from being permanently damaged. So after he sneakingly portrays Palazzo, Frank Drebin ends up sneaking into the position of the umpire for the game. And while doing so, he makes some absolutely horrible calls on the field. He ends up fighting with another umpire. As the batters come up to the plate, he frisks them, which is absolutely hilarious and ridiculous at the same time. But ultimately ends up stopping Reggie Jackson, who's this programmed killer who's out to kill Queen Elizabeth II, and ends up saving the day despite all his ridiculous and slapstick activities. So then after Frank Drebin saves the day, his umpire mask comes off. You got people realizing that it's the guy that just sang the national anthem. So, hey, that's Enrico Palazzo.
And then the whole crowd goes wild for him at the end. So now Enrico Palazzo is a hero who saves the day.
There's another hilarious sequence in The Naked Gun where Frank Drebin starts off in this office, which he inadvertently sets on fire. And to escape, he goes out to the ledge outside of the building. And as he's out there, he realizes as he looks down how high up he is. He sees the traffic down below. And as he's trying to stabilize himself and move down the ledge, he grabs onto the breast of a statue and then subsequently both breasts of the statue and then the arms. And then he keeps moving. And at this point, a woman has come out. She opens the window. She's looking out. He grabs one of her breasts. She freaks out and starts screaming. As he continues moving towards her, he ends up grabbing both of her breasts. She flips out. She ends up falling backwards. He kind of loses his balance and falls and grabs onto the penis of another statue. And he's holding on for dear life. And then same woman ends up looking out and watching what he's doing. And we kind of see at one point he's got both hands on the phallus and trying to pull himself up. So we got like this pseudo fellatio kind of imagery going on. And the woman's just freaking out and screaming. So finally, Frank's able to pull himself up off the ledge. While he does so, the penis ends up rotating into a vertical type of position. And as he's trying to get into the window of this room, he breaks the penis loose, falls through the window, gets up kind of dazed, and he's kind of mumbling and walking towards the woman. He's got the penis in one hand and he's approaching the woman. She's looking at him and screaming, and he realizes what he has in his hand and he quickly puts it behind him. It's just a hilarious scene, and you can't give enough credit to Leslie Nielsen, who at this time in his life was probably in his late 50s, if not 60s, and just having a ball, I'm sure, doing this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the humor there is just inspired. I mean, every step of the way you see each thing developing as it comes, and it's just one thing after the next that you're just like, oh man, they're going all the way with this one.
I actually had seen recently an interview when Leslie Nielsen was on a talk show. I can't remember if it was Carson or some well-known talk show, and he was apparently notorious for bringing this little fart machine, this fart sound maker with him. And so even on talk shows, you know, he'd be asked questions, he'd be sitting there with a smile on his face and just cracking himself up, cracking up the audience, cracking up the host. And the guy was just a riot on screen and away from the screen.
Interesting. Yeah, that you wouldn't know it from his earlier work. I mean, certainly he's got a great sense of humor.
Yeah, especially like in Creepshow, he played this asshole creepy guy that ends up killing Ted Danson's character and a woman's character in an episode from that film. And then not many years after that, he ends up playing Frank Drebin. It's a pretty great career move.
So in the same year, we have A Fish Called Wanda, which is a throwback to the Ealing Studios type comedies that were done a few years earlier in England. This one, though, is known for the outstanding physical humor of Kevin Kline, who actually won Best Supporting Actor for his performance. Some of the humor in that comes from very uncomfortable situations, like when he's trying to extract information from Michael Palin's character, Ken, who has a stutter, and he's basically torturing the guy by sticking French fries in his nose. And he's struggling to get the information out. He's eating his fish to get him to cough up some information. Gets his revenge when Kevin Kline's character, Otto, gets his foot stuck in some cement. And Ken is driving a steamroller at extremely low speeds in order to run over him. Naturally, Otto assumes that Ken doesn't have the guts to actually kill him, so he's taunting him and basically deriding him as he's driving in this very slow motion vehicle to try to hit him. And then finally it dawns on him that Ken is absolutely determined to get his revenge on him, in which case then he starts to realize that it's about to be curtains for him. So anyway, they kind of soft pedal a little bit by showing him actually on the wing of the airplane at the end of the film that he's still alive. So they try not to make it so horrible that he would die in such a terrible way. But it's kind of a dark comic moment that works really well in the context of a film that's really kind of a spoof in some ways of heist films. And by the way, all the films that we've been discussing in the modern context for the slapstick films have been spoofs, and we are going to address them later under that context. So then getting a little bit more to the present day, Honora has some slapstick humor in it as well. particularly the home invasion scene where Annie's been left alone by her recently betrothed, who runs off in fear after he finds out that his mom knows that he's gotten married to a stripper. So as she's trying to defend the homestead, she's trying to fight off these Russian mobsters, and it gets into some pretty extreme physical violence, but it's actually kind of funny at the same time that she's taking on these mobsters single-handedly. So she actually ends up doing quite well in the fight, and you kind of get this sense that even though there are these men who are much bigger than her, she ends up standing up for herself to such a degree that you're quite amused that she's actually seems to almost have the upper hand in some ways throughout this whole scene.
Yeah, I remember when I saw the film in the theater, thought the scene kind of went on for a little bit too long. But then in a subsequent viewing, I'm like, you know what? It's so funny. There's such hilarious dialogue. And to watch her just kind of like manhandle these guys on a second view, and I didn't feel the scene went on too long.
So in discussing these films, we've hinted at what the tropes are, which primarily involve that there are situations in which there may be physical injury, but no injury is ever permanent in these types of stories. Like I was saying in A Fish Called Wanda, he gets run over by a steamroller, but yet they still show him on the wing of the airplane at the end. So they don't want you to walk away thinking there were actors or animals hurt in the process making this film. There's one exception to this, of course, which is the way The Naked Gun treats O.J. Simpson's character. So he ends up in the hospital and in a wheelchair toward the end of the film and actually plunging down a bunch of steps and flinging off the balcony of the stadium that they're at. What's kind of interesting about this is when you're watching it from a current perspective, you know the things that O.J. Simpson allegedly did and probably did do that were horrific. And it's kind of fun actually watching O.J. Simpson get treated in such a way to where his character actually does have some negative physical results of these incidents.
Absolutely. It's hard to watch O.J.'s footage of him playing football now, but to see him get totally messed up in the Naked Gun films, that's kind of rewarding in kind of a perverse way.
So the subversion of Slapstick would be a film like Life is Beautiful, which does play into the physical humor tropes in which the father character played by Roberto Benigni in an Oscar-winning performance does pratfalls in order to amuse his son while they're going into a concentration camp, which is not the most humorous of settings to have this type of humor. But the point of this is that the father's trying to distract his son from the actual horrors that are going on so that his son is not scarred by them. So he does pretty successfully to the point that he's ultimately killed in the story. So he also doesn't want his son to realize that that's what happened to him. Even up to the point where he dies, he does protect his son to the very end. So it is a heartwarming, yet also heartbreaking type of story that, because it's so sincere and serious about its consequences, this is a significant subversion of the slapstick genre.
Yeah, I remember the Academy Awards that year. The memory that stands out in my mind is Roberto Benigni climbing on the seats in the auditorium. That's always stuck with me since, because you've got the slapstick in the film, and yet you got this kind of performance in real life that is really unique and kind of like he stole the show that year from what I remember.
Yeah, in a sense, the spirit that he conveys in the film, he actually conveyed it during his acceptance of the awards. So people were just ecstatic to see him perform during his acceptance speech and so forth. I mean, a lot of people who have issue with treating such a serious subject with humor, again, just give it some time, and maybe if the first time you saw it or even the second time you saw it, it might have rubbed you the wrong way. Ultimately, the sincerity of its message comes through, and even the initially offended can be won over by how it accomplishes that.
As mentioned earlier, you might find physical humor in films of the spoof genre, and we've touched on a couple already, Blazing Saddles and The Naked Gun, but we need to reiterate Mel Brooks' Blazing Saddles. Also, Mel Brooks again, we've got to touch on Young Frankenstein from 1974, which is a spoof of the Universal horror films from the 1930s and 40s. We've got Scary Movie, directed by Keenan Ivory Wayans from 2000 and its numerous sequels since then. And it spoofs modern horror films, Scream, The Ring. I think the recent one even spoofed the Terrifier films. Art the Clown is kind of the new horror hero in the horror slasher genre. Then we have 2021's Don't Look Up, the Adam McKay film that kind of spoofs disaster films, where we have Leonardo DiCaprio's astronomer who discovers a meteor that's on his way to Earth and is going to end up destroying the planet, but he can't get the powers that be to listen. So what are the typical tropes of the spoof genre? Well, the characters take what they're doing very seriously. They act like they're in the real film that they're spoofing. That is, up to the point where they break the fourth wall and acknowledge that they're in a movie, commenting on other movies. Many characters in the spoof genre films are exaggerated versions of actual characters from other films. Also, situations reflect similar circumstances from spoof films, except at times to show how things would actually fall apart if the situation played out as it would in real life. So in these aforementioned tropes, they're used to poke fun or find humor in the films that they spoof. But an example of a film that subverts the genre is Wes Craven's Scream from 1996 that comments on the modern horror genre. The scares in Scream are very intense and real, as is the bloody violence and gore. The motivations are grounded dramatically, even as the film operates in a meta-commentary way about itself. The film even dares to ignore the fact that it was just supposed to be funny instead of going for the jugular and actually being frightening.
Yes, the humor from Scream comes from the acknowledgement of the things it's commenting on, which one would say maybe is clever more than funny. One can kind of see the intended humor kind of lurking around the edges of Scream, but ultimately the film is just too scary to not work as a horror film as well. The next genre of comedy we'll get into is teen comedies. This type of comedy really found its heyday in the 1980s, and one filmmaker in particular had a very clear voice about how to tell these types of stories, and that was John Hughes. He didn't really operate within the normal environment of Hollywood. He kind of had an outsider's perspective that was perhaps grounded in his native Chicago. But his film from 1985, The Breakfast Club, established many of the tropes that one take for granted now in teen comedies. One trope in particular is that the character's social status in high school is determined by which group that character is a member. It also addresses the youthful rebellion trope in which the youth have a justifiable right to be angry at the adult characters, which is often coupled with the incompetent adult trope that shows that the adults really don't know what they're doing either. Some of the scenes in The Breakfast Club get into outright drama from the characters reflecting on the reasons why they are the way they are, largely caused by the failures of their parents. A little bit more lighthearted is Ferris Bueller's Day Off from 1986, which is a youth fantasy film that again uses the youthful rebellion and incompetent adult tropes to skewer the adult world's restriction of youth. The main attraction of the story is that we get to watch Ferris get the better of almost everybody else in the story, especially the principal, Mr. Rooney, who is determined that he's going to bring Ferris down. Ferris's sister wants the same thing because she's jealous of how popular he is. Throughout the film, Ferris is characterized as having near superhuman capabilities to manipulate people and is able to supersede the limitations of the adult world. We become co-conspirators with Ferris as he talks to us by breaking the fourth wall throughout the film, even at the end of the film when he tells us to go home and stop watching the film because the credits have finished and we need to leave, which is something they actually made fun of in Deadpool, if you recall.
I do. You know, most of John Hughes' work kind of hit in the perfect time for me as I was a teenager growing up in the 80s. And his casting was always so right on. That's not an exception with Breakfast Club and Ferris Bueller. Great casting. The other thing about John Hughes films is his choice of music. I cannot think of The Breakfast Club without thinking of Simple Minds, Don't You Forget About Me. Anytime I hear that song, I automatically think of The Breakfast Club. And then with Ferris Bueller's Day Off, I can't help but think of Yellow's Oh Yeah. That was just, in my mind, such a big part of that film. But yeah, just a little aside about John Hughes and his use of music in films. It just holds up so well. Amy Heckerling's Clueless from 1995, which was loosely based on Jane Austen's Emma, tells a story of Cher, played by Alicia Silverstone, who's a rich, popular Beverly Hills high school student who kind of plays matchmaker for her friends and her teachers. And it's a romantic comedy with those related tropes, but the film also has many of the same high school cast tropes that we've previously discussed, with the exception of that Cher is part of the rich clique, but she's not a villain. She's the likable protagonist of the film. Like Ferris Bueller, Cher can charm or use her wits and intelligence to get her way in the adult world, and her resulting tactics are kind of a little less combative form of rebellion. Superbad from 2007 was co-written by Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg, and it's a coming-of-age story and a prime example of a one-night Odyssey trope in the form of youthful rebellion. We've got Jonah Hill and Michael Cera playing two high school buddies, and they've got a friend of theirs nicknamed McLovin, played by Christopher Mintz-Plasse, who has a fake ID from the state of Hawaii that actually lists his name as McLovin. And so the concept behind the film is Jonah Hill and Michael Cera's characters are basically trying to purchase alcohol for a party so that they can impress the young ladies that they have a fancy for. It gets into the circumstances that they end up finding themselves in as they're dealing with students that are older than them, as well as some incompetent adults. The social hierarchy in the film is not as rigid, so it somewhat subverts that trope, but it still clearly has the incompetent adults. And in this film, it's primarily the police officers that are portrayed by Bill Hader and Seth Rogen. They're kind of bumbling and just completely incompetent.
So the subversions of the teen comedy you have to actually go back to the beginning of the 80s to find one of the most prominent examples, which is Fast Times at Ridgemont High from 1982. It's not that there isn't any comedy, there is some, but I think even the studio was shocked to find how, frankly, the film addressed actual teen issues that were facing teens of the day. Some of the issues include teen sexuality and abortion, and the film doesn't use the type of glibness you would normally expect from a teen film in addressing these issues. The film is based on Cameron Crowe's research as an adult who went back to high school to get his degree, since he became a professional writer and hit the road following rock bands before he was able to finish high school. So as he observed the high school environment around him, he was able to have an adult's perspective of what made the social system in the high school tick. Despite all the serious subject matter, there's still plenty of humor in the form of Sean Penn's Jeff Spicoli, which is one of those classic characters that everybody remembers after seeing this film. The ways that he tries to get under the skin of Mr. Hand, one of his teachers, including bringing pizza to class, is only outmatched by Mr. Hand's cleverness at defeating his efforts to destroy his teaching environment. When Mr. Hand gives the pizza that Spicoli brought to class to all the other classmates instead of him, this was not how Spicoli had this figured out. What's also interesting is that this film undermines the incompetent adult trope by showing that Mr. Hand is actually a teacher who cares about his students. And when he shows up at Spicoli's house to get back the time that Spicoli took from his class by actually teaching him a few things about the subject, it's actually kind of heartwarming to see that much sincerity from this teacher, which actually kind of wins Spicoli over, that Mr. Hand isn't so bad after all.
Yeah, this film kind of touched a nerve with me because I was born and raised in Southern California. And in the 70s and 80s, I knew guys like Jeff Spicoli that acted that way and spoke that way. There's no doubt Cameron Crowe really did some accurate research on creating his characters for this film. The other big thing about this movie is the meet up at the mall lifestyle that was popular back in the 70s and 80s. As a kid and teenager, we'd meet up with our friends at the mall, and even if we didn't have money to buy stuff, we'd maybe get something to eat, maybe go to a movie, walk around, look at stuff, but not necessarily buy stuff. There was a big part of what we did with friends back then was going to the mall. Arcades were a big thing. We'd go to the arcade and play video games, and thanks to shopping on the internet these days, the kind of the mall lifestyle I kind of enjoyed as a teen and child is kind of gone by the wayside.
Yep, the mall, arcades, cruising, those are all things that are very real to our experience when we were growing up. So yeah, it does feel very real. And I think the interesting thing is the studio was wondering if the subject matter was just too intense, and they were very scared that Heckerling was putting some of this stuff out there in this way. But when the audience was packing the theaters, they knew that actually they had hit instead of going too far. So then in 1989, Cameron Crowe re-ups with the genre with Say Anything in a little bit more focused way, in that he's telling the story of two particular individuals who don't really fit in any particular cast whatsoever. One of them is a brainy girl that everyone looks up to and thinks that she's kind of out of everyone's league because she's both beautiful and brilliant. Meanwhile, the character that's interested in her, Lloyd Dobler, played by John Cusack, is very popular and doesn't really have much direction other than the fact that he likes her and he wants to be with her. So this film traffics in very sincere emotion between these characters and doesn't seem like it's trafficking in lustful adventure at all. You kind of root for these two characters to actually go all the way because it might result in them being a power couple with real potential. Unfortunately, her dad doesn't feel that way because Lloyd's chosen career as a kickboxer doesn't really appeal to him. Ione Skye's Diane has such respect for her father's opinion because she thinks he's infallible, so she doesn't want to engage in any youthful rebellion at all. Once she finds out, though, that he is fallible and actually is not the person that he says he is, the incompetent adult trope does creep back in a bit, but it's absolutely well-founded. He cut corners and broke the law, and he betrayed her trust that he was the person that he said he was. So her rebellion is completely justified in this instance. So this is the kind of thing that Cameron Crowe brings to his material, is that he doesn't just engage in tropes for the sake of touching on well-trodden ground. He actually tries to explore those tropes and find the real issues that underlie them. So this film has significant impact, and actually there was a callback to it in the final season of The Bear, where the final scene of Say Anything is actually reflected in what another major character in The Bear does involving a trip on an airplane. I'm not going to do any spoilers since The Bear just dropped, but for anybody who has seen the show, just watch the last scene that involves Richie and his companion on an airplane flight, and you'll know exactly what I'm referring to.
Michael Lehmann's film Heathers from 1988 is a black comedy and teen satire that has themes of popularity and rebellion and violence. And Winona Ryder plays a character by the name of Veronica, and she ends up getting involved with a clique of the popular girls, the Heathers at school. There's three of them, one of whom's played by the late Shannon Doherty. The film fully embraces the high school cast tropes, but it's also shrouded in darkness where most teen comedies kind of embrace the lighter side of things. For example, we're exposed to Veronica's thoughts through her diary entries, and they're initially rather naive kind of teen concepts, but they eventually become dark confessions and later kind of rebellious against the popular girls at school, the Heathers. She ends up becoming the girlfriend of a character by the name of JD, played by Christian Slater. In Heathers, the high school environment is one to survive, not simply enjoy. Later on the podcast, we're going to discuss the film Mean Girls and how the Queen Bee characters kind of relate to the clique of the popular girls in school. So whereas Mean Girls Queen Bee is taken out by accident, destabilizing the hierarchy, in Heathers, each successive Queen Bee that is murdered is replaced by another one. So the Heathers are killed by Veronica's boyfriend, that's Christian Slater's JD, who sets it up so it looks like they committed suicide. And this is a dark twist on teens having sex trope in that JD is the one killing people in the film. And this action could ultimately end up getting one's SAT scores sent to San Quentin rather than Stanford, as Veronica muses in the film. Heathers shows that the only way to defeat the system is to take control and then rule through benevolence, as Veronica does, as she ends up defeating JD. She ends up faking her own suicide and then shooting JD, disarming a bomb that he had. JD subsequently blows himself up outside without killing anyone else at that point or damaging the school building. Interestingly, this film kind of anticipated a rash of high school shootings that occurred before Columbine and the subsequent school shootings that have transpired in years since.
Even as you rewatch this film now, the prescience of it is pretty shocking that this is kind of where the world has come. Back in the day when we were in school, we didn't do lockdown training out of fear that people were going to come in with guns to blow up the school. I mean, we didn't have that fear. But even without that, the way that the film anticipated that would happen is quite interesting. And if you think about it, the anger and the frustration and the cruelty, it was always there. We knew it was there as we were going through it. But it's almost like instead of directing that energy just into killing themselves, some of these kids ended up deciding that they're going to take down a bunch of people with them. And that's something that has definitely changed since we grew up.
Yeah, I remember in my childhood years of the 70s and 80s, other than the occasional fire drill, I do remember back during the Cold War times, we did duck and cover in case of an attack. But it was nothing like what the kids have to prepare for these days with heavily armed nut jobs showing up at a school and just blasting kids at random. It's rather tragic. Alexander Payne's Election from 1999 shows how politics that exist in high school are really a microcosm of the real world, especially when adults get involved in the process. Tracy, played by Reese Witherspoon in the film, is destined to become the class president, but her quest is stymied by Jim McAllister, a school teacher played by Matthew Broderick, who persuades Paul, played by Chris Klein, to run against her as a popular alternative. Paul's resentful sister, Tammy, played by Jessica Campbell, run against not only the other candidates, but also the whole idea of student government that gets the anti-establishment crowd to back her up, potentially turning the entire school upside down. The contention of the film is that the outside world is the school as reflected in our own elections, as we see the likes of Al Gore, George W. Bush, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump in this 1999 film that predates all of the elections of the aforementioned.
Yeah, I think Tracy kind of reminds me of Hillary Clinton, and that in some ways she's competent, but in other ways you just don't want to see her win. And I think that's what we see with Matthew Broderick's character is that, okay, she's destined to be some kind of political leader someday, and I've got to stop her now before she becomes this person later on. And Al Gore's kind of also that person that you could imagine. He was always destined to be a politician. But the thing is, Chris Klein's character, he's the guy you want to have a beer with. So that was George W. Bush. You know, people are like, oh yeah, he's a great guy. He may not be the brightest bulb, but I like him, so I want to vote for him. The election ends up being neck and neck between these two people, between the person that has pretty much set her whole life up to try to be in this position, and this guy that kind of, in a half-hearted way, says, oh, I think I'll just run for class president.
So yeah, Matthew Broderick's Jim McAllister in the film is just putting his finger on the voting scales to alter the outcome of the election, kind of what some people believe is happening in the real world.
So yeah, again, the satirical element of the film works really well in that it brings up real issues that we're talking about to this day. So as mentioned earlier, Mean Girls is another definitive high school cast film. It owes a lot to Heathers, but it's not quite as dark. It doesn't have quite the subversiveness of its message that was so caustic in that earlier film. The one thing that's also interesting about it is that it tries to address how to take that caste system apart. And it actually goes through a systemic process to discuss that. First of all, it brings up the aspect that you don't have to necessarily be born into a specific caste in order to become a member of it. The character of Katie that Lindsay Lohan plays doesn't originate in the rich girl popular caste. She only becomes a mean girl when they invite her into their group. Heathers does kind of touch on this, where Veronica becomes a Heather by being invited into the group, but she is also of the same social class as the Heathers. So in a sense, she was invited because of her social qualities. The steps that the film explores about how to break apart the queen bee paradigm, the first step is to get the students to trust each other instead of thinking that everyone's just going to backstab them. So there's an actual trust fall demonstration where a person allows themselves to drop backward and expect that their classmates are going to catch them if they do so. The second step is to actually take out the queen bee, which the plot engineers by having Rachel McAdams' Regina get hit by a bus. This leads to the dissolution of the plastics that are the top of the food chain at the school. The third step is taken by Katie at the spring fling when she wins the crown, but instead decides to share the crown with the other students in the school. In doing so, Katie shows that there is no social hierarchy anymore, and that your social status no longer has to be a zero-sum game where there's a winner and everyone else is a loser. So once the kids all recognize that this is the case, the social hierarchy can fall apart. So this sounds like it's kind of serious, and the plot of the film does work in some dramatic senses, but it's also humorous along the way as well. A little bit more overtly funny is the film Booksmart from 2019, which is one of the wittiest scripts that's come out in the last few years. One of the points of this film is that you don't get to pigeonhole teens just because they're from a particular social class. So it kind of attacks the initial trope established by The Breakfast Club, Heathers, and the like. Like Superbad, this one has a One Wild Night Odyssey plotline, but this time they're using two female lead characters instead of male leads. But while Heathers was dark in its witty script, this one is a little bit more screwball in delivery.
Another subgenre of comedy is the mockumentary, and we've got some really fun examples here to discuss. The tropes of the mockumentary involve the ability to emulate the techniques of real documentaries, where a casual observer may not pick up that they are spoofing documentaries, since the characters act as if the circumstances are real. Mockumentaries also include the use of talking heads and narration. There's often handheld photography, as well as unprofessional or natural light. And then finally, mockumentaries break the fourth wall by revealing that there's a documentary crew filming this mockumentary. One of my favorite this is Spinal Tap, the late Rob Reiner's mockumentary from 1984 that chronicles the behind-the-scenes activities of the fictitious rock band Spinal Tap and their process of creating music and touring. The film is just a lot of fun. It stars Michael McKean, Harry Shearer, and Christopher Guest as the members of the band. It's just a hilarious film. And one of the moments that stands out for me, and I think a lot of people that've seen it, is the discussion about the amplifier going up to 11. And so Rob Reiner, who is the documentary filmmaker, asks, well, why don't you just make 10 stronger? And the response is, but it's 11. It's just great. Waiting for Guffman in 1996 is directed by Christopher Guest, who also stars in the film. And it chronicles an amateur community theater cast in a small Missouri town. Cast members include Eugene Levy and kind of the usual collaborators that this group of filmmakers gets together. Best in Show from the year 2000 is another Christopher Guest directed mockumentary. And this film very humorously chronicles the eccentric dog owners as they prepare for the Mayflower Kennel Club dog show.
Yeah, it's a special creation, and Christopher Guest, you have to say, is the mastermind of this thing because he's really gotten it down to a science. His character of Corky St. Clair in Waiting for Guffman, I mean, he's so serious about his art, but yet the community theater stuff that they're doing is so amateurish that you just got to laugh that these people are taking it so seriously. The fact that they seem like they're really these people, and you're just kind of laughing at how they're just missing the context of everything. Like you have one character say, Corky, he's really brilliant. He writes, he directs, he performs. And I think the only person that you can really say that about that does those things is Barbra Streisand. So he's like comparing this guy to Barbra Streisand. They're like he's some brilliant genius or something. So I mean, these people really have a very poor idea of where they really stand in the world. Corky's like, I'm hoping that we can get this to Broadway and they'll pick it up. And you're like, what's wrong with these people? So, and then like one of his actors drops out of the show. And this is one of the best slams by a director about their actor. The guy's quitting the show and he's like, I hate you and I hate your ass face as he's screaming at him on the telephone. So it's just brilliant. He's talking about that they did a show of Backdraft in the community theater in the town. And he's like, I wanted the audience to feel the heat. He's like talking like how sincere his artistic expression of Backdraft is for the community. And Fred Willard in Best in Show, when he's making his comments about the dogs and stuff, that's just comedy gold. Like if you ever heard a guy going off during the Westminster Dog Show, you'd be just like, oh my God, this guy, what's he doing here? This commentator, he has no idea what he's talking about. And he's just going off of these digressions and just talking about stuff. And it's just really great.
I wouldn't be surprised if he was probably just ad-libbing a lot of that.
He probably was, honestly. Yeah, they're brilliant.
Just getting back to Spinal Tap really quick, you can't help but crack up at the titles of their songs and the lyrics of their songs. And you look at some of the hair bands from the 80s and some of the music and song titles, and it's just as absurd. It really is. I remember one album was like Slip of the Tongue, and there's just countless like ridiculous titles with ridiculous songs.
Do you remember the Spinal Tap album that they did? Like, I think it was one of the later versions, Break Like the Wind.
Yes, yes. And, Big Bottom to me is just like classic. It's just great.
And the Stonehenge thing.
Stonehenge was awesome.
Yeah. Would he put the dimensions down in inches instead of feet? And they're expecting this big thing to come down to the stage. And instead it's this kind of tiny little thing. They're like looking at it like, that's not what I had in mind.
Yeah, that's not going to work. Yeah. And, the guys are actually musicians too, the actors. And they really do a hell of a job because they're great performers. And it just kind of reminds me so much of the crap that was getting thrown up by real bands in the 80s.
Yeah.
It's hilarious.
Yeah, it's a great parody. They do a great job with it. So, anyways, a subversion of the mockumentary. District 9 is a very serious science fiction film, very dramatic in its focus, that tries to kind of ape the mockumentary by the fact that the first part of the film is they're making a documentary that's following them along as this team is exploring the situation in a segregated community where the story is that the aliens that came to Earth in a spaceship, they were stranded and society needed to create a community for them that was isolated from the rest of humankind. So as it plays out, it addresses a social structure that's similar to South Africa with apartheid. And this was actually a film made by a South African director. He's exploring these social themes in this structure at first like a mockumentary, and then it becomes a full-blown satire over the course of the story. So the main character actually gets exposed to a chemical that starts converting his physiology into a quasi-alien being, and then it becomes a full-blown satire the rest of the way. But the mockumentary setup is how they start the film. So it's a full subversion of the mockumentary genre on that basis. But that leads us directly into the subject of satire. So the satire is a usually cynical, but sometimes not so funny political takedown of aspects of society. Satire is considered a comedic form of narrative, but sometimes there aren't a whole lot of laughs involved, and that's where people get confused because they're asking, should I be laughing at this or should I just be acknowledging the commentary that's on display? So the tropes of a satire is that you're exaggerating an actual societal characteristic to criticize it, or you're placing an absurd element into an otherwise normal situation to prove the absurdity of the whole concept. Sometimes it involves a role reversal that underscores the wrongness of a concept or an institution. So in this regard, District 9 is trying to criticize apartheid by showing it in the context of an alien-human interaction as opposed to when it's just a set of human beings that are doing this to each other.
Another example of satire that's more traditionally humorous is Preston Sturges' Sullivan's Travels from 1941. In this film, Hollywood director John Sullivan, played by Joel McCrea, gets tired of directing comedies. And so what he ends up doing is disguising himself as a hobo to experience the hardships of poverty, basically, in a life unlike the one he lives. During the events of the film, he ends up on a chain gang and ultimately realizing that laughter and comedy are very crucial and important aspects of life and happiness. The film includes some screwball, dramedy, and slapstick elements, but it ultimately skewers Hollywood's self-importance by showing how little the real struggle its members realize. I mean, Hollywood, you've got the wealthy, the stars, the producers, they live a life of luxury and really don't have any concept of the life of the poor living on the street. The film also stresses the importance of escape and laughter for much of the audience. And you must ask yourself, though, does the meta commentary actually skewer its own satirical point as it gets more dramatic? The answer is no, because self-reflexivity in itself can exemplify artistic meaning when the film satisfies its own terms, as well as this film does.
Yeah, I got to say, this is a fun film, and there's some outright humorous slapstick moments that are pretty broad. So you can enjoy it on that level, or you can enjoy it for its message. And where Veronica Lake's character comes into the picture, the director attaches himself to her. It's actually a pretty winning romantic story that they have that underscores a lot of this as well. So I became a Veronica Lake fan after watching this film because there was something about her realness that really made me sympathize with her. And I think it got through to the character as well. You kind of see why then he starts to understand that he is privileged and sometimes people need a little bit more to get them going through life that he doesn't really need.
Another example of satire is the producers. And there's been 2 film versions, Mel Brooks' directorial debut in 1967, as well as another version in 2005 directed by Susan Stroman. In the original, we had Gene Wilder playing an accountant, Leo, and we had Zero Mostel playing the producer, Max. In the subsequent version, we had Matthew Broderick playing Leo and Nathan Lane playing Max. Either film essentially satirizes the entertainment industry and the corporate accounting world. The producers here realize they can make more money by closing a play and keeping the investment money rather than opening to a profit and having to split greater than the 100% of investment shares themselves, presuming the play turns out to be a flop. In essence, the producers rob little old ladies of their money while putting on a play called Springtime for Hitler, which, of course, their plan backfires when the play turns out to be a tremendous hit.
Yeah, and who would have thought anything called Springtime for Hitler would be popular with the public? But what's ironic about it is that people don't appreciate it for its face value. What they realize is that it's hilarious that this concept even exists. So people are laughing at it, thinking it's a comedy, when the original script was written by a Nazi who had these sincere views that he was trying to convey. This was an actual artistic expression that the writer that they bought the script from had, and they thought it was hysterical that no one's going to want to see this, but it turned out everybody wants to see it because they're like, can you believe they made this thing? So it is really a hilarious concept. And again, Mel Brooks stepping on that third rail, making fun of Nazism, as the joke. But I guess, he's a Jewish guy and he's willing to take that risk because he knows he can get away with it. And boy, does it work. It is absolutely hysterical.
It's worked quite a bit for Mr. Brooks.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, he ended up writing the songs for the play. So the lyrics of the songs, he got involved in that. And then they adapted that play into a film to give it a second life. And so I honestly prefer the original film, but a lot of the same elements make the musical version work as well. All right, so we've talked about MASH in prior episodes from 1970. It's a satire that comments on the heroism that's reflected in the typical war movie by making the lead characters doctors in a military unit who lack military disciplines. These characters are thumbing their nose at the military structure that they're dealing with. It also makes fun of doctors, for instance. They'll do anything if they get a chance to play golf somewhere. And also has a quite hysterical football game at the end in which the meaning of sportsmanship is also attacked. I mean, if you want to try to win a game by basically injecting one of the other players from the other team with a sedative or makes him delusional to where he thinks that he's running a track meet instead of playing in a football game, that's not exactly the upfront way to try to win a game.
No, drugging your opponent, that's not quite sportsmanship.
No. But I could see a clever doctor maybe doing such a thing if they think that that's the way that they're going to pull this one off. Mm-hmm. The film attacks religious hypocrisy as well, famously. But certainly all the way through, they do all this with great humor. There's a pretty steady set of jokes throughout the film that bring all these elements to light in a humorous fashion. Then 1976's Network, not quite as funny on a surface level, but just as poignant at attacking the corporate profit motive in television, as well as other aspects of morality within society. So the story here is that one of the network anchors goes off the rails, but he gets higher ratings when he's stating his editorial views than he did as just an anchorman. So with that in mind, the network decides they're going to make money off of this version of his performance, even though the guy is essentially heading off a cliff while stating all his most personal views about every subject you can imagine. So what's happening here is the network is co-opting the anti-establishment perspectives of the frustrated viewers and turning it into another source of ratings. Another program that they decide to pick up involves having a documentary crew follow around a group of communists that have rebellious intent. William Holden plays the head of the news division, who represents the old school values of journalism and sees this whole system coming off the rails, while Faye Dunaway plays the cold-hearted temptress that lures him away from what he believes to be real and sincere, including his wife, played by Beatrice Straight, in a Oscar-winning performance as supporting actress. Most people who are aware of this film are familiar with the "I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take this anymore" soliloquy. The scene where a group of communists argue about their net profits in a network meeting is absolutely a riot for anyone who's ever worked in the entertainment industry.
So yes, there are subversions of satire, and one example is The Truman Show from 1998, directed by Peter Weir. In this film, Jim Carrey plays the lead character of Truman, and ever since he was born, he's been the subject of a reality show and broadcast for the viewers to watch and enjoy. Other cast members include Laura Linney, who's kind of set up as his wife, Meryl, and Ed Harris, who plays Christoph, who's the director of the show. The movie is a skewering of reality TV and virtual living, and has gotten more relevant in the years since its release. For example, since 1998, internet technology's improved. We get news almost instantaneously these days. Obviously, reality TV had become a big part of our television viewing, or some people's television viewing, since 1998. In terms of the surveillance world, security cameras are hard to avoid now. A lot of us have those Ring cameras on our front doors and Nest cameras inside our homes. And we all have smartphones that we carry around with us. So not only do the smartphones give us access to instantaneous news, but they give us access to 4K cameras where we could whip them out and instantaneously film people or events and post those videos online. And as we know, things go viral in a heartbeat these days. However, the film ultimately rejects cynicism in favor of rooting for Truman in order to find a meaningful authenticity. As those that have seen the film know, Truman escapes from his staged reality at the end of the film in order to find his own life and own identity. In essence, the dramatic elements win the day as part of this uplifting conclusion of the film.
Yeah, it ends up being something that actually says something more about reality than just the virtual world, because in a sense, Christoph is playing Truman's God, in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
And
he
so
controls
Truman,
the weather. And
right. So when Truman decides to embark on getting out of the television set world that is his world that he knows, he's kind of going outside the programming of what has been set up for his life, and he's deciding to reject it and just throw all abandon to the wind to escape it. So it's a really noble, dramatic moment when he goes out and Natasha McElhone's character goes to meet him so that they can escape from that paradigm together. It's actually a very fulfilling, dramatic beat. I mean, this is not satirical cynicism at all. This is a completely sincere hope that you have for their characters. And it's not what you expect from this type of movie to be that sincere.
Yeah, I remember seeing this in the theater, and my mind works in the way where I'm watching this movie and I'm going, this is like the epitome of a mind fuck. I mean, here's this guy, he's going around and he's realizing there's cameras everywhere watching him. He eventually realizes that this whole life of his is staged and that people are watching his life for entertainment purpose. His wife is staged, everything's staged. It's like the psychological effects that could cause on somebody, it's unfathomable.
Oh yeah, and like when his wife goes into commercial mode, like she's pushing a product, if you're a real person going like, why are you talking like that? That's very strange. Like, I know you love this product, but you're really selling it pretty hard here, So that would be weird.
Another subversion of the satire is Edgar Wright's Shaun of the Dead from 2004, starring Simon Pegg and Nick Frost as two buddies in what starts off as like a typical zombie-related social criticism in a humorous kind of fashion. However, what the film really kind of explores is modern capitalist society, in that people are kind of already zombies before they're bitten and turn into zombies. And what I mean by that is people go to work, they sleep, they hang out, their lives are kind of mundane and thoughtless without a lot of creativity and a lot of variety. And so much of the horror and treatment of death in the film is serious enough to work as a genre horror film. But again, the underlying theme of the movie is really kind of showing what capitalism and a mundane life do to us. Mike has already talked about Anora, but we're going to bring up Anora, Sean Baker's film from 2025, because this film depicts class warfare through the guise of a pretty woman style romantic dramedy that descends into a dark comedy. The absurdist element here is the fact that the marriage of Annie and Vanya is not only being split up by Vanya's parents, but also by the members of the Russian mob. We've got a rich versus poor struggle in this film. We've got the rich in terms of the Russian mob, where they've got the power and the brute force and the weapons to force control. And then you've got Annie, who is this struggling young lady who's a stripper and also an escort when she needs to be to make a living. It shows the real disparity between the two class systems. So the audience begins to empathize with Annie at the end of the film, where Igor, who is a Russian mobster that has a liking for her, gives her the wedding ring that Vanya had given her earlier in the film. In a transactional manner, she makes moves to thank Igor with sex, but Igor really cares about Annie, and so Igor leans in to kiss her, and she fights him off because she's not used to this. The film ends with Igor holding her, and she's lying down on top of him, and she begins to sob. The audience begins to see that she's a very damaged person, and her relationships have been transactional, sexual, for money. And now she's experienced something that's rare. She's found a man that cares about her and doesn't want to go straight to sex. And so that's kind of a crack in her persona that the audience realizes at the end of the film.
Yeah, the film actually destroys the idea that it's meant to just be a cynical takedown of Pretty Woman, because it does create audience identification with her at the end. And she seems like she's been so tough through most of the film to where we can maintain a cynical distance from it. But ultimately, it kind of goes for the heart at the end, and you feel for her, which is a surprising tactic for satire to ultimately take, but it is a subversion. And so another final example of a satirical subversion is One Battle After Another. This film has some screwball elements at times. It also has some slapstick elements at times, but ultimately it is a satire. But I'm not even sure whether the audience completely recognized it, whether it was being a drama or a comedy. One thing that it does do initially that is fairly overt for people to pick up is that the dramatic action hero trope that we're going to get into when we talk about dramas at a future episode at some point is subverted in that Leonardo DiCaprio's character, because you're casting a major actor in this role, we're thinking that this is going to be the hero of this action-based story. But actually, the setup of the film is more that he is a revolutionary character, and we're also set up by films to think that this is a person that has a noble cause in mind. As we get to know this character more, he isn't even a noble revolutionary trope of a character either. Most of the resistance in the film, the group that Leo is a part of, is performative, in that the intentions of these characters doesn't seem to be terribly noble much of the time. Yes, it's true in the opening scene they try to help some captured immigrants escape, which might seem noble. But as you get to know their characters over the next few minutes after that scene, their motivation makes their intentions look much less virtuous. Not doing much better are the characters that are part of the establishment, which represent more of an authoritarian deep state antagonist. Much of the film attempts to portray Colonel Lockjaw, played by Sean Penn, as being pathetic and inept. So basically, no one gets through this film unscathed. The screwball scenes in the film involve the lead character's lack of efficacy, while also demonstrating that the revolution has descended into bureaucratic ineptitude. There's an extended sequence where he's trying to remember the password in order to prove that he is who he says he is, which stymies him to the point where he never can reach the people that he needs to talk to without making some threats. He's more of a Karen than someone like Che Guevara. Other examples that show this film is not a standard action thriller, but is really a satire, includes the fact that there's a damsel in distress who doesn't end up getting saved by the hero, as would typically be the case in this type of film. Instead, she ultimately saves herself, although to give Leo's character some credit, he did teach her enough self-preservation techniques in order to save herself. Offering more confusion for viewers is the fact that many of the real-world immigration concerns displayed in the plot, as well as the white supremacist authoritarian conspiracy subplot, actually reflect some aspects of society that people are sincerely concerned about. Because of when the film was actually made versus the change of the social environment since the time it was shot, some of these leftist musings come off being a little bit too on the nose to seem like absurdist satire. Perhaps over time, as there's more distance from the realities on the ground, from the subject matter of the film, the tongue-in-cheek nature of the film will become a little bit more obvious to people and give it more credibility as a satire. On the other hand, it's also possible that as people look back on the film, the ways in which it engages in satire instead of actual dramatic exploration will be viewed as discrediting it. No one knows for sure exactly how this will transpire, because only film history looking back will be able to determine this ultimate result. But the one element of subversion of the satire that this film was intended to be will continue to subvert it, which is the ending of the film in which Chase Infinity's daughter character heads out to continue the revolution in its current form with a sincere closing note of hopefulness that perhaps the next generation can do better than their predecessors. No matter which side of the aisle you're on, surely we can all agree that we need to do better about bringing change to our society to defeat injustice and not follow in the past examples that this film explores. As a final note, it's interesting that the confusion of the era of this film, namely that it shows rebellious activities from the 1970s while mixing in current subject matter, makes it all the more confusing for either political side to get behind some of the messages in the movie. But maybe we shouldn't take it all so seriously anyway and just give Paul Thomas Anderson, the film's director, some credit for trying to do something a bit different that takes left turns where most of Hollywood's output is trying to give us the tried and true. So while I wouldn't say this is the film that I would like to see Paul Thomas Anderson get his Best Directing Oscar, I'll at least agree that he was overdue for some of his earlier works. And like The Departed, this film at least makes you stop and think about what films are supposed to do to keep you off balance and not delivering everything that you expect.
Yeah, I think even Paul Thomas Anderson himself commented that the Academy made him wait a long time, but they finally rewarded him for his cinematic efforts. And, like you touched on, Scorsese didn't win the Oscar for Best Director for the film that he should have. I think a lot of us agree it should have been Goodfellas.
Yeah, and Raging Bull, I'd say.
Yeah, probably so. But at least he finally got his directing Oscar, and The Departed is still a fine film. So subgenre of satire includes bureaucratic satire, and the purpose here is to mock our bureaucratic world. A good example is Terry Gilliam's Brazil from 1985, which stars Jonathan Pryce as a daydreaming clerk named Sam, who ends up trying to correct a typographical error in his mundane job and ends up resulting in the death of an innocent man, labeling Sam as an enemy of the state. The film was shot in 1984 and definitely intended to reflect elements of George Orwell's novel: oppression, bureaucracy, citizen surveillance, conflict between reality and fantasy. At times, the film's humorous, yet at other times it's disturbing, but always creative and thought-provoking. There's a major controversy at the time with the ending. Terry Gilliam had a rather dark ending that we'll discuss shortly, but Universal Pictures, and in particular Sid Sheinberg, saw the film with Terry Gilliam's planned ending and wanted the film recut. But Terry Gilliam ended up showing his cut to the Los Angeles Film Critics Association before Universal could release the film. And by doing so, he got a lot of attention for the film and ended up getting a lot of awards for the film from the LA Critics Association. So Terry Gilliam ultimately won out, and his cut of the film was released to the public. So while Sid Sheinberg's cut is a happy ending where Sam ends up with Jill, the love of his life, in the countryside, Terry Gilliam's cut was the right cut. The system always wins. And basically what we find in Terry Gilliam's version is that at the end, Sam is strapped into a chair, having been tortured by government officials. He's gone insane, and we hear him humming the song Aquaria do Brasil, which means aquariums of Brazil. And it's a very tragic ending that shows honorable man succumbing to the bureaucracy that ends up taking away his freedom and his mind and his life, essentially.
Yeah, and actually, much of the film, like you said, there's a conflict between reality and fantasy, and it gets into his fantasy world throughout the film. So it kind of makes sense that as he goes nuts after the torture and he's lost his mind, that he's completely disappeared into this fantasy world that I'm going to escape with Jill. But as we pull back from it, he's really locked inside his own mind, and the consequence is a negative one. It's kind of like Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, where the character, he's being hung, and you imagine that the rope snapped and he escaped. But then a moment later, the rope snaps and he's dead, and everything about escaping was all in his imagination. So this film kind of follows that little pull of the rug, like you were saying. It's just all that he's imagining and not what reality is.
And kudos to Terry Gilliam for taking on the studio, and particularly Sid Sheinberg, who had quite a reputation in Hollywood, and ultimately getting his director's cut released as the theatrical cut. So Mike recently mentioned the film Network from 1976. We're going to mention it again here as a bureaucratic satire. Howard Beale, played by Peter Finch, is an aging news anchor who has a mental breakdown. He's threatening suicide, and he ultimately is killed by communists. And again, we see the system here win over the individual who dares to fight the establishment and the outrage of the masses. The meaning here being that ratings ultimately prevail and humanity is lost. Can't help but think about this film without reiterating the common expression, if it bleeds, it leads, which unfortunately seems to be a pretty common denominator with media these days. How often do we see uplifting positive stories? It's mostly, war, somebody died, somebody was murdered. I mean, it's usually negative material that ends up getting the ratings and ends up going viral.
Right. So by giving the public what it wants, you're redirecting their outrage to something and then giving them some kind of catharsis that kind of like the gladiator fights in Rome. You're giving them some kind of outlet for their frustration. So the co-opting of the outrage by the network into ratings is how the bureaucracy absorbs those resistance points in a society and then redirects them. It's interesting how it's done in this film, where they get to kill two birds with one stone. They get to have their communist plot line lead to an attack on an institution, and that institution happens to be this guy who's gotten too powerful as a mouthpiece of resistance, and they get him killed as the final act of their storyline. It's a really cynical view of things.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think it's a pretty real view. The older I get, when I think about my interests and what I see in the world, there's no doubt humanity has bloodlust. Just last night, there was a real popular UFC fight with Conor McGregor. Didn't last long, but UFC's huge. I mean, people love seeing people pummel each other and blood everywhere. Like I've told you in our conversations outside of the podcast, my feelings about humanity for the future are not very bright. And I know that sounds horrible and negative and pessimistic, but I don't know. I mean, I don't see us growing or changing much.
Yeah, I agree. In that vein, you're not dissimilar from the person who can claim authorial ownership of the film Dr. Strangelove, Stanley Kubrick, who many people would say that he is too dry, too cold, but he has a very cynical view of humankind. So let's get into discussion of that 1964 masterpiece of the bureaucratic satire. Here, what's being attacked is the military bureaucracy. In particular, we have a structure which allows a rogue general, whose name happens to be General Jack D. Ripper, who single-handedly orders a first strike on the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Obviously, there's a military bureaucratic failure to allow something like that to happen. So then in comes the attack on the political bureaucracy when we get introduced to the American president, who is going to do the best that he can to stop the attack from happening. Meanwhile, though, there is a plan that the political elite have to escape the consequences of such nuclear devastation that would result if the plan fails, which is to bring all the top men in society into bunkers where they can shack up with a number of women to repopulate humanity. So this is the plan that's explored toward the end of the film, that, if we screw it all up, this is our off-ramp to get out of this. And I guess Kubrick did some research into these things to know that this is something that was on the agenda as a plan B if something was to happen. But, it's not enough to just attack the American military bureaucracy or the political bureaucracy of the United States, but also he's going to attack the Russian bureaucracy. Apparently, he did some research into the idea of whether the Soviet Union had a doomsday machine that would, in the face of a first strike by the United States, launch their missiles even if no one was around to order them. Naturally, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have such a device if you don't tell anyone that it exists. So what he put into the story of the script for Dr. Strangelove is that the Russians hadn't gotten around to announcing to the world that they had this thing, so that if they were attacked, they would take the whole world down with them. The film also then shows that there's a huge problem that the Soviets have, that by keeping it a secret, what kind of deterrent effect would this possibly have? So basically, he's skewering everybody in this film, all the bureaucracies and all the inept thinking. It's a very cynical view, but it ends up being very humorous. We're going to actually get into a few more details later as we talk about another aspect of this film under a different category, but just to give you a little taste, that's kind of where we're headed with this particular discussion. Going back to MASH, the bureaucracy it attacks is again the military bureaucracy. Remember, at the time this film was made, the Vietnam War was still going on. You could say that the politicians weren't terribly popular because we weren't winning this war. We weren't getting out of this war fast enough. We were sending all these young men to go over there and die for what purpose, nobody knew. Even though the film is set in Korea, it kind of shows that the system isn't that competent anyway. At the end of the film, we do see the primary character we've been following, Hawkeye, being able to go home and to finally get out of the mess that he was in. But there were other characters that they made the point of saying that they were still going to have to keep pushing on through whatever the next steps of the war were going to be. And like much of the audience, the Vietnam War was still going on at the time of 1970, and everybody was still faced with that and just frustrated with the whole bureaucracy that led to the circumstances that we were in as a country at that time. So a very topical film for that era.
Paul Verhoeven's RoboCop from 1987 is another film that viciously skewers corporate philosophies. Near the beginning of the film, an executive of a company called OCP, which essentially runs the police in the city, gets blasted by a robot prototype known as Ed 209. And after this disgustingly violent and vicious accidental murder, a vice president indicates that it was just a glitch. We're going to get it fixed. There's also a variety of parody satirical commercials in the film, one of which discusses the 6000 SUX, a fictional vehicle in the film that gets really shitty gas mileage, but if you want, you could get a punk stereo with it. In the final act of the film is a character named Dick Jones who says to his criminal conspirator, Clarence Bodiger, "We practically are the military," which kind of symbolizes this harmony between government and corporate entity with regards to warfare. And so in RoboCop, Dick Jones is able to provide Clarence Bodiger and the other criminals with a variety of sophisticated weapons that they can use to try and destroy RoboCop, but they're not successful. Also, as it relates to bureaucracy, Peter Weller's Alex Murphy in the film essentially signs his life and even body parts off to OCP, the corporate entity that's mentioned in the film. And there's a sequence where RoboCop is being assembled, and there's a character that basically says, "Lose the arm." And so ultimately, Murphy's human arm is removed, and he's given a complete robotic prosthesis. The example here is that we have the corporate world taking over this man's life and body and doing what they want with it, in essence. But as those that have seen the film know, there's some of Murphy that remains, and as the film progresses, some of Murphy's memories as a human come back, and he regains some of his humanity even in his RoboCop form.
Yeah, basically, as you described it, the film explores how the corporate/government power structure is taking our humanity away, and the struggle of the character is our struggles. That's the satirical point that we get from this story as we root for him, is to fight for our humanity against the inhumanity of this corporate/government partnership that is taking it away from us.
One of RoboCop's prime directives is he's not to harm a executive of OCP. And so at the end of the film, where Dick Jones gets fired, RoboCop is suddenly able to take care of Dick Jones and rid him of that world.
Yeah, so the corporate protections that he had no longer apply. Once he becomes a common civilian, he is then vulnerable to get Murphy's countermeasure to take him out of the equation.
Nice shooting, son. What's your name? Murphy.
Yes. All right, so moving on from bureaucratic satire, we're going to get into what's called Manipian satire, which targets belief systems and ideologies. If your belief system and ideology is government related, then I guess there's some overlap between the last subject and this one. So that's where we'll get into Dr. Strangelove again. The ideology that's attacked in Dr. Strangelove is trust in the military and the government. The ways that this is attacked is even in the naming of the characters. Kubrick puts it in the most basic way. Many of the characters are stereotypical in their behaviors, including the aforementioned General Ripper, who has an obsession with fluoridation, distorting our precious bodily fluids, and he believes it's a communist tool to contaminate us, which is reflected in the anti-vax debate that we're having in society to this day. George C. Scott plays the very macho General Buck Turgidson, beautifully named because turgid means something that is swollen, perhaps by fluids, and I can only think of one part of body that is meant to actually reflect. So the implication here is that General Turgidson gets his rocks off by engaging in violence. George C. Scott, though, wasn't terribly happy with his characterization because Kubrick asked him to undertake some more exaggerated rehearsals, which Kubrick was filming, and Scott was not aware he was going to be using those takes in the actual film. So when he did see the final film, he said, "I'm never going to work with Kubrick again because he tricked me, and this is not what I had intended to put out there." I would say, though, that most people that see the film think that George C. Scott is absolutely brilliant in this role, and it's a hilarious performance.
Yeah, it's too bad he ended up feeling that way.
He just had artistic differences, I guess, so we'll just leave it at that.
Yeah.
Now, Peter Sellers turns up in multiple roles in the film. The highest in the hierarchy on this film is President Merkin Muffley. Which presumably implies that the president is a bit of a pussy. That's what I would say. We also have Colonel Bat Guano, who is a seriously stupid individual. When Peter Sellers' other character asks him to shoot up a vending machine so he can get some change to call the president to tell him the codes to call back the bombers that have been sent to bomb Russia, the guy tells him that he's going to have to answer to the Coca-Cola company if things don't go the way that he hopes. So I'm sure that this was not his major concern at that point. A little bit of bureaucratic satire mixed in there. Now, the Soviet premier's name is Dmitry Kisov. President Muffley's phone call to tell him this horrible news that the bomber group is on their way interrupts the sleepover that Kisov is having with his mistress at the time. It is pointed out in the war room by the ambassador of the Soviet Union that the premier is, of course, a man of the people, but is still a man as well. So that explains his late night foray. And then not to be forgotten is the German expatriate advisor to the president, Dr. Strangelove, who has some serious Nazi-like tendencies that he has not quite gotten out of his system at that point in his career, as he tries to incorporate some of those values into the American philosophy. Some of these themes were addressed in the film Marathon Man in the 1970s in a little bit more subtle way, but it's just hard to believe that this film was released with such caustic views of our society at the time that it was released in the early 60s.
Another example of Manipian satire is Don't Look Up, the 2021 film directed by Adam McKay, which stars Leo DiCaprio and Jennifer Lawrence. We've already discussed how the film is a spoof. Now let's touch on how it's a satire. So the film uses the spoof format to satirize climate denial and the efforts to profit from it. Like Dr. Strangelove, it shows how the rich and politically powerful would attempt to escape a global catastrophe, unlike the rest of us poor souls that are probably going to be stuck at home waiting for the world to end. The satirical bite of Don't Look Up really shows itself when the rich and powerful take their spaceship ark to another planet, and once they exit this vehicle, they're suddenly eaten alive by these alien creatures. So good riddance to you. In a similar vein is Paul Verhoeven's Starship Troopers from 1997, a searing indictment of American cultural values, rivaled only by Avatar for its far-reaching scope. Subject matter here includes militarism, fascism, propaganda. One of the key elements in the film is you serve in the military in order to become a citizen. Most people didn't pick up on the Nazi propaganda motif in the film until much later. And in fact, the film kind of opened to not very exceptional box office numbers. I think the satire of the film kind of went over the head of a lot of people until it kind of got a cult following.
Yes, this is true. I did not see it that way myself. And it was later that I picked up on things. I mean, on the surface level, I was thinking to myself when watching it, why is it that these characters, I just don't identify with them? They are such flat, uninteresting stereotypes of American type characters. And I just wasn't grasping that the entire point was to just skewer action film tropes and a simplistic, jingoistic type mentality of the Born on the 4th of July type character who just decides he's going to go to war and believe everything that he's told, that this is a noble purpose. But when you see it the second time and you're saying, oh, this is by design that these characters are this way. And I mean, they're saying that this whole ideology that these people have is what needs to just be attacked by the subject matters. It's brutal. As you mentioned with the Avatar reference, I mean, Avatar, there's a lot of colonialistic attitudes and America's militarization and profit motives and all those things that are integrated into the plot line of that film, to the point where I think a lot of the rest of the world actually appreciated some of those messages in Avatar more than people here that really probably didn't see it as such a harsh criticism. But this one's just even more vicious at attacking the essence of Americans. And it's just hard to believe that an American studio would make a film that just viciously attacks the American ideals like this film does. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, definitely. And like RoboCop, with its parody commercials, Starship Troopers kind of has these little vignettes throughout the film praising what serving can do for you. They always end by the catch line, do you want to know more? So it's a really cleverly made film that unfortunately it didn't get the attention it deserved at the time. Okay. We've touched on Network pretty well with this episode, but let's touch on it again really quickly. Network from 1976. This film attacks the profit motive and how the corporatization of society will lead to the ultimate downfall of ourselves as well as our culture. And then Mike just recently touched on the film MASH, Robert Altman's 1970 film. This film attacks blind and hypocritical religious views, as well as the rigid military mindset. And once again, let's touch on Blazing Saddles from 1974, which touches on racism, societal ignorance, and the political system.
Okay, so now moving into dark or black comedy, in which case you're dealing with sometimes morbid or traumatic type events that are played for humor, which seems like it may be sort of antithetical to one another, but it does actually work. A good example would be Harold and Maude from 1971. We get a lot of mileage in the story watching our lead character, played by Bud Cort, trying to kill himself through various creative ways just to get the attention of his mother, but she doesn't seem to take it seriously. So there's some very dark humor there. That's about as serious a subject as you can imagine. So he's kind of losing a sense of any of the luster of life. Finally, though, when he meets this older woman who is much older than him, she is elderly, actually, toward the end of her years, and she teaches him how to engage with life once again. So sometimes when you get to the bottom of the well, that's when everything looks better to you, and that's kind of how dark comedy works. Things can't get any worse than this until they can. So in this case, he does see that just by shifting your prism, you can determine that life is worth living after all. So in the last episode, we talked about The Ref, which is a highly underrated anti-Christmas film. So the dark comedy comes from the fact that there's a kidnapper played by Dennis Leary. This film involves a married couple going through counseling who are kidnapped by a jewel thief who is trying to get out of town and has to buy time by keeping them pent up even though they're expecting the relatives to come over for Christmas Eve. You could say hilarity ensues when he realizes he's met his match as these two bitter individuals attack each other viciously while he's just trying to get them to stay on the plan to help him get out of town. It gets even more hilarious when he has to play the role of a marriage counselor when the family comes over and he has to keep everybody in line. Making fun of divorce is not typically a humorous subject, but again, by showing the absurdity of such a situation, the dark comedy really makes a bad situation humorous, which is the point of this type of storytelling.
Another example of a film with dark comedy elements is RoboCop. This film is extremely violent and gruesome. The ultra-violence and much of the insensitivity on display in the film from all characters is beyond some of the satirical elements, but conveys an emotional detachment that is comical in its extremity. There's one particular scene near the start of the film where Clarence Boddicker, a real meanie played by Kurtwood Smith, blows off one of Alex Murphy's hands, and after doing so says, "Give the man a hand." And then one of Clarence Boddicker's henchmen unsympathetically asks Murphy, "Does it hurt?" As mentioned earlier, the film also has some pretty clever parody commercials. One of them is for a family game called Nukem, where essentially you get together as a family and the game is kind of like Battleship and yet encourages children to participate in nuclear war. There's also another commercial for the Magnavolt car security system where we see a car thief pick his way into a car, get inside, and then suddenly he's trapped, electrocuted, killed, and then thrown out so that the owner doesn't have to deal with the body. As we continue our discussions here of dark comedy, we have to mention Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction from 1994. This film rides on the border of crime drama as well as dark comedy with often some uncomfortable humor and some gore too, violence. But somehow the film subverts black comedy by presenting a sincere existential perspective in its final act that has dramatic resonance, and the meaning behind it is that people must create their own meaning in life, even though they're living in a chaotic and absurd world.
Another dark comedy that mixes a crime story with comedic elements is The Big Lebowski from 1998. This one's a little bit more broadly comedic than Pulp Fiction, though. Not quite as dark either. When you have scenes like when John Goodman's character Walter misdistributes the ashes of Steve Buscemi's character to where it blows onto himself and the dude played by Jeff Bridges, this is comedy gold. Also, every scene that has John Turturro's The Jesus is disturbingly funny in a very dark sense because we know this character may actually be a pedophile, and he has some very strong stereotypical attributes on display as well that make the characterization completely unsettling to watch. When we talked about the slapstick elements of Honor from 2024, the slapstick actually is more of a darkly comedic pratfall because the violence is more real than typically on display in a slapstick film. So the groundedness of Honor makes the slapstick more dark than it would typically be. If you want to get into true subversion of dark comedy, you got to go all the way with a film like Funny Games, which explicitly makes efforts to discomfort the audience by making the audience feel complicit in the horrors that are being shown in the film. This is a feature of the design of the film, and any laughter that would result would be out of sheer discomfort of watching, as opposed to being considered amusement.
Martin McDonagh is a filmmaker who subverts the dark comedy genre. McDonagh is a British-born Irish playwright become filmmaker in Bruges from 2008, deals with two hitmen played by Colin Farrell and Brendan Gleeson, who are essentially hiding out in Bruges, Belgium after a botched job. They're essentially seeing the sights and engaging in existential conversations as they're ordered to lay low. In another McDonagh film, 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri from 2017, deals with a mother played by Frances McDormand's propaganda war against local police when her daughter's murder goes unsolved. In The Banshees of Inisherin from 2022, Brendan Gleeson tells his friend, played once again by Colin Farrell, that he doesn't want to be friends anymore because he's too boring. McDonagh's films have gotten more dramatic and satirical as he's developed as an artist, but underlying all of them is an honest and yet uncomfortable take on the foibles of humankind. For example, in 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri, he dares to find humanity in Sam Rockwell's racist cop. This is done far better than anything we saw in Paul Haggis's Crash from 2004. McDonagh also argues that the social divide in Ireland is pointless, as 2 lifelong friends arbitrarily go to war because one suddenly decides that he doesn't want to maintain a friendship any longer, even if he has to cut off his own fingers in order to end the relationship. Because of these dramatic elements, McDonagh's films subvert the genre by making us care for these people and not just scoff at their identifiable flaws. As a fan of his films, I got to say I'm looking forward to his next cinematic endeavor, which is Wild Horse 9, starring Sam Rockwell and John Malkovich, the first trailer for which I watched countless times because I was just cracking up. It looks like a lot of fun.
All right, so now moving on to our final subject, which is dark satires. Many black comedies are satirical and vice versa, but the films that we're going to be discussing here are especially savvy in their social critiques that tend to be more caustically, if not shockingly funny than the standard satire. So we discussed earlier that Dr. Strangelove was a bureaucratic and manipulative satire. But think about this. The end of the film shows the world being destroyed, and then Kubrick chooses a lovely song, We'll Meet Again, by Vera Lynn, to play over all of these nuclear explosions going on. This goes beyond bureaucratic or manipulative subject matter. This is amusement at the destruction of the entire planet. It's kind of hard to imagine that anyone in the 1960s was laughing at that particular time at such audacity. I mean, when people were doing duck and cover, at school as they're being raised, I mean, this just isn't funny, I'm sure, to them. But at this point, looking back on it, it's hysterical that someone would do such a thing to their audience. I mean, it's like mocking the audience to do such a thing. So as distance has increased with time, the film's musing about, well, we're going to have multiple women for each man in these underground bunkers, and the general's getting all excited about the prospect that this is going to be what he has in store for himself if all this happens. It's like, I mean, with this in mind, I mean, who could expect that they wouldn't just go ahead and launch everything because this is going to be such a great result? We just get this wonderful ratio of female to male interaction, and it's just for us, the special elite people. So the mocking of this concept is definitely blistering social critique going on here. I think many of us would say that the expansion of the distance between the normal person and the ultra rich has only gotten worse since 1964. So God knows what they got in store for us at this point.
Absolutely. It's only been in recent weeks that we now have our first trillionaire with Elon Musk. I mean, who would have thought a trillionaire? It's like something out of a sci-fi movie.
And how many baby mamas does this guy have? See what I'm saying?
I've lost count. I can't keep up.
Kubrick was right on. I mean, people talk about how predictive Eyes Wide Shut is with the whole Epstein thing, but I mean, Dr. Strangelove in this feature, he's right on. Once again.
Well, each of those baby mamas has a Tesla, by the way.
Probably. Hopefully they're not one that's programmed to like get into an accident if he gets pissed off at one of them.
Ooh, that's a good kind
How's
of
that
sci-fi.
for a darkly comic thought?
Yeah, that's right in there.
All right, so Fargo from 1996. This is another one. Okay, so what's the satire here? All right, first of all, the film professes to be a true story. So they're trying to make you think, this is something that's a real situation that actually happened. But they lied. It's not a real story. But the point I think they're trying to make is this is something that is just absurd enough that it could happen. We're talking about some serious Darwin Award type behavior in this movie. I mean, we got some really idiotic people in this story that this film is just credible enough to where it could be real. So we got a satire of small Midwestern views and mannerisms that are pretty accurate. I mean, the folksy manner that they capture, these people talking to each other, I mean, it's pretty recognizable. As a Midwesterner, I have to say I was quite amused. I mean, it's really more just caricature for the sake of having it. But anyway, as caricature, it works pretty well. Throughout the film, it does stay darkly humorous. At times, you got some interesting things like when the wife is trying to hide from the kidnappers and she's hiding in the bathtub. She realizes she's been caught and she takes off running through the house and she's wearing the shower curtain and she can't see where she's going. She's bumping into things, falling down the stairs. I mean, it's funny. It wouldn't be if it really happened, but it's just the way they shoot it is pretty darkly funny. So it continues to have some of these darkly humorous beats until you get to the ending. And this is where the subversion kind of steps in a little bit. So we got Sheriff Marge Gunderson, played by the brilliant Frances McDormand in her Oscar-winning role here. She berates the stupidity of the entire scheme with the murderous character played by Peter Stormare and his role in all the tragic events that occurred. Now, remember, where she caught him was when he was trying to dispose of the body of his co-conspirator, Steve Buscemi, in a wood chipper. The guy's feeding a leg into the chipper and he's having trouble like getting a thing to go in there and blood's going all over the snow and everywhere. And I mean, it's shocking, but it's again, like RoboCop. It's so absurd and over the top, ultra violent that you just kind of have to laugh at the audacity of trying to show this in a film. And then you got to remember that this entire plot was put into place because poor Jerry Lundegaard, played by William H. Macy, he didn't get a business deal given to him by his father-in-law, who's wealthy, and he's so bitter about this that he decides to come up with his own scheme to get the money, which is by having his own wife kidnapped. Who would ever expect that everybody would just all end up dead? I mean, who would ever think such a thing? What a brilliant scheme this is. But the point of all this is that all the pettiness that led to this whole scheme being devised, it's the kind of absurdity that you just imagine that as humans, there are some of us that are stupid enough to want to do all this stuff. So if this story didn't actually happen, there are so many other stories out there that did that probably would make this look like brilliance by comparison.
I was going to mention Peter Stormare. He's great in everything he does.
Yeah.
And he's always so quirky, and everything he does is just uniquely weird, but he's great. He's a blast to watch.
The scene in the car with Buscemi's going like, oh yeah, okay, no talking, fine. I'm not going to say anything to you. Not another word. Not a single one. he can't stop talking.
He can't shut up.
The other guy is just like, you know, oh, two can play this game, tough guy.
Yeah, it's great. And once again, we got to mention The Big Lebowski, the Coen brothers' masterpiece from 1998. This film has several character stereotypes that are satirically mocked, such as hippies, the dude, doesn't like to work, smokes weed, hippie. We've got the aggressive, angry veteran, Walter, played by John Goodman. We've got the innocent friend, that's Donnie, played by Steve Buscemi. And then we've got the wealthy people maintaining a false facade. In this case, it's the big Jeffrey Lebowski, who behind the scenes is not really wealthy. We've got the self-important artist type, in this case, Maud, portrayed by Julianne Moore, who's known to suspend herself, fly in the air, and splash paint while she paints her paintings. And last, and certainly not least, is the macho, aggressive Latino character. In this case, the Jesus, played by John Turturro, the very opposite of the historical figure upon whom his name is based, because in this movie, the Jesus uses foul language and all kinds of disgusting physical gestures that are scene-stealing, but don't live up to his namesake.
Yes. This reminds me of another film that addresses the whole Jesus and Latino twist on the name Jesus, which is usually Jesus. The film Clockers, which is a Spike Lee film, there's a scene where Harvey Keitel's character is talking to a guy and he calls him Jesus. And the guy says, no, man, it's Jesus. And Harvey Keitel's character tells him, I feel more comfortable calling you Jesus. And it's like, right on, man, I get it. Our culture just isn't comfortable with the fact that the Spanish culture, Jesus is a common name, and we're just not used to that. So, I mean, the Muslim culture, Muhammad is the most popular name in the entire world, but we just aren't used to calling people Jesus in this culture. So I love that kind of humor, with that culture clash kind of humor.
Why did you and I end up with such boring names, man? Why couldn't we be Jesus or Muhammad?
Yeah, I don't think I could live up to that name, so I'm not going to even go there.
I've been called worse than my name, so I guess it all works out in the end. All right. And then we got to mention Heathers once again. This film satirizes high school social politics and how adults misunderstand the causes of what makes teens harm themselves and one another.
Oh, there's some fantastic humor in this film about the principal and the English teacher trying to figure out how they're going to deal with the suicides going on in the school and the discussions that they have. The English teacher's going off with some great idea she's got about how to get everybody to come together. And the principal just says, yeah, just call me when the shuttle lands. And is what he tells her. I don't think usually they talk to each other quite so plainly in these discussions, but it was a pretty humorous scene. And then when it's all, comes back around and more people are dying, and she's like, yes, we took this as an opportunity to let's make fun of the hippie again. So anyways, some subversions of the dark satire. Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Basterds from 2009. This movie satirizes World War II films by actually making the Allied Special Forces team seem as brutal as the Nazis, and actually maybe a bit less sophisticated when considering how respectable the Hans Landa character is that's played by Christopher Waltz. He comes off like a fairly reasonable person in comparison to, let's go kill some Nazis. That's how the Americans come off in this film. And then there's the revisionist climax at the end of the film, which kind of subverts everything, because what we get is this kind of Wizard of Oz homage where you've got this imagery on the screen playing and there's fire in the theater, and we have this Jewish revenge fantasy that's comparable to the ending of Raiders of the Lost Ark. And I saw a clip actually just today where they asked Tarantino, how did you decide on doing this ending where you have something happen that clearly didn't happen in reality? I mean, you got Hitler getting killed in this theater when the bastards catch him and everything. So he's like, well, I don't know. I just went to bed one night and I wrote this down before going to sleep and saying, well, I'll look at it in the morning and I'll see if this idea is any good. So then I woke up the next morning, I took a look at it, and he's like, yeah, this is a great idea. And so he was off and running. We get this metaphorical message in the film, which satire does well. In this case, the metaphor is that the killing takes place in a movie theater. So ever since World War II, films have been skewering the Nazis ever since, and probably have caused as much damage to their ideology as anything that happened in the war. Between Schindler's List, Inglourious Basterds, and so forth, Raiders of the Lost Ark, this is pretty interesting metaphor for a satire. So then he tries it again in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood from 2019. The target of satire in this film is the film industry. So in that regard, it's kind of an ideology satire, like a Manipian form satire. We have flawed lead characters in the film in the form of Leonardo DiCaprio's self-important star, his stuntman and best friend, played by Brad Pitt, who won the Oscar for this role. So the revisionist ending this time involves the Manson family killings, particularly that of Sharon Tate. So this time the attack is stymied by the heroic Rick Dalton, lead actor, and his stuntman Cliff, and they get to do all kinds of brutal takedowns of the Manson family killers. And with that, the fall of the counterculture does not happen in the same way. That was the result of the Manson family murders that precipitated that event.
I'm looking forward to the Cliff Booth film directed by David Fincher. Apparently Tarantino's script for that sold for $20+ million.
Well, we've seen Tarantino's work get adapted by Tony Scott and Oliver Stone, although Tarantino would say that Natural Born Killers is not his story anymore because Stone rewrote it so much. But yeah, it'll be very interesting to see what a director who has his own voice for sure, and it's not like Tarantino's, how he takes that material and puts his spin on it.
Another subversion of dark satire would be the 2019 film Parasite, directed by South Korean filmmaker Bong Joon-ho, the first non-English film to win the Academy Award for Best Picture. And it's one of the most deserving Oscar winners for Best Picture in probably the last 30 years. Recognized by critics and industry insiders on a level unparalleled amongst other films of the 21st century. The first half of this film depicts class warfare by the way of a lower-class family, the Kims, infiltrating an upper-class family, the Parks, in order to gain economic advantages for themselves. The second half of the film largely removes the comedic elements to actually integrate drama, suspense, and tragedy to make its allegorical points. Some critics of the film say that its metaphorical symbolism is too obvious to be so highly praised. But the metaphors are so obvious only because the film is so well executed that one wonders why someone never used film language with such skill to illustrate these metaphors. Therefore, one could presume that Alfred Hitchcock would have marveled at this film.
Yeah, I would say that Hitchcock operated in this vein somewhat himself, but without quite the same level of social commentary in most of his films. So in that regard, I think this is something that would be looked at as an extension of Hitchcock's life's work and a strong homage to that. So we covered all the topics for this episode. I want to leave you with this final note. It seems that comedies have been gaining recognition in recent years with the Oscars and so forth. Comedies have won nearly half of the Best Picture awards over the last 15 years. We can just go through the list. What we're referring to, The Artist from 2011, Birdman in 2014 would be considered a dark comedy. Green Book from 2018, even if it had lost to Black Klansman, that was an even darker comedy than Green Book. Parasite is mentioned from 2019. Everything Everywhere All at Once in 2022, which many would say is an absurdist comedy, and One Battle After Another in 2025. So if La La Land had won over Moonlight, it would be the longest period that comedies or musicals predominated in the Best Picture race since the period of 1956 to 1968. During that time period, you had edgier comedies like The Apartment in 1960 and Tom Jones in 1963 that had won Best Picture. And then you also had musicals starting to take on weightier themes as opposed to the backstage antics that were normally the subject matter for musicals. Some examples during that period were West Side Story in 1961, which addresses gang warfare set to the story of Romeo and Juliet. My Fair Lady in 1964, which dealt with class issues set to the story of Pygmalion, written by George Bernard Shaw. The Sound of Music in 1965 addressed a family being hunted by Nazis. And then Oliver from 1968, which is based on Charles Dickens' classic story, takes on issues such as orphans and poverty. So the kinds of issues that have been raised in this current batch of much darker comedies, could it be that in our cynical age, making fun of our existence is becoming the dominant artistic expression of our times? That's a question to think about.
All right, this concludes episode 13 of Celluloid Dreams, the Psychology of Film. Mike and I will return soon with episode 14, where we're going to move into our standard format, whereby we're going to choose one particular year and a great film from that year that we're going to discuss in detail. Additional episodes of the podcast are available on Amazon Music, Apple Music, Spotify, YouTube, and iHeartRadio. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon with episode 14.